If you start mocking it or making believe that isn't existing, then it's just not going to work.
On screen, everything about The Sound of Music felt warm, almost untouched by anything ugly. The laughter looked real, the bond between the children felt natural, and for years it left the impression that what you saw was exactly what it was. But according to Angela Cartwright, that picture wasn't complete. Behind the songs and the smiles, there were moments that didn't make it into the final cut. Moments that changed how the experience actually felt for the young cast living through it. So what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling? And how different was that set from the one audiences still remember? Join us as we go behind the scenes of the film that looked flawless on the surface, but carried moments that would completely change how you see it. Growing up in Salzburg. The grueling 6-month shoot of The Sound of Music. Angela Cartwright stepped into the role of Brigitte von Trapp, one of the von Trapp children whose quiet intelligence and watchful nature often said more than words ever could. On screen, she blended seamlessly into a family that felt almost too perfect to question, her presence adding to that sense that everything about their world was steady, warm, and untouched. The film itself carried that same feeling from beginning to end. The Sound of Music arrived in 1965 under the direction of Robert Wise, built on a screenplay by Ernest Lehman, and drawn from the stage musical created by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Beneath it all was the real story, first told in The Story of the Trapp Family Singers by Maria von Trapp, though what audiences saw was a softened version, one carefully arranged to feel comforting from the very first note. Set against the backdrop of Salzburg, the film followed Maria as she entered the von Trapp household, brought life back into a rigid home, and eventually found herself drawn into something deeper with Captain Georg von Trapp. Around them, history moved quietly but firmly, with the looming presence of the Anschluss pressing closer, even as the story tried to hold on to its light. Filming stretched from March to September 1964, moving between Los Angeles and the real streets and landscapes of Salzburg, giving the film that sense of authenticity that made it feel lived in rather than staged. When it finally reached audiences through 20th Century Fox in March 1965, the reaction was not as unified as the film itself might suggest. Critics were divided at first, unsure of what to make of something so earnest, so committed to its tone. But audiences saw it differently. Within weeks, it rose to the top of the box office, and by the end of the year, it had become the biggest film anyone could talk about. Then it went even further, overtaking Gone with the Wind to become the highest-grossing film of its time, holding that position for years while continuing to pull people back into theaters again and again. It did not fade quickly either, staying in circulation for years, returning for re-releases, and reaching millions across the world. Recognition followed in a way that only reinforced the image the film had already built. It took home 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, earned major honors at the Golden Globes, and secured its place in film history when the American Film Institute ranked it among the greatest American films ever made. Later, the Library of Congress chose to preserve it, calling it culturally and historically significant. But while the film continued to stand as something polished and almost untouched, the experience behind it, especially for the young cast living through those long days, carried details that never made it into any award, any ranking, or any carefully framed scene. From Cheshire to Hollywood, the unbelievable childhood of Angela Cartwright. Long before that perfectly arranged world of music and mountain air, Angela Cartwright was already finding her place in front of the camera, building a career that felt steady even at a very young age. Alongside her older sister, Veronica Cartwright, She moved through early success with a kind of ease that made it look almost natural, as if this path had been waiting for her all along. She was born on September 9, 1952, in Altrincham, Cheshire, England. But that part of her story didn't last long. By the time she was a year old, her family had already crossed over to Los Angeles by way of Canada, settling into a place where opportunity seemed closer, more immediate. And it didn't take long for that opportunity to find her. At just 3 years old, she appeared in Somebody Up There Likes Me, playing the daughter of a character portrayed by Paul Newman. It was a small role, but it opened the door. Not long after, she shared the screen with Rock Hudson and Sidney Poitier in Something of Value, stepping into a world that was already far bigger than most children ever experience. Television soon became a constant presence. For 7 seasons, she appeared on The Danny Thomas Show, working closely with Danny Thomas. That connection didn't end when the show did. It stayed with her, lasting quietly in the background for years, right up until his death in 1991. By then, the work had already left its mark, not just in the roles she played, but also in the relationships that came with them. Then came the role that would place her inside something far more lasting. As Brigitte von Trapp in The Sound of Music, she became part of a story that would travel across generations, collecting awards and recognition along the way, even surpassing Gone with the Wind in box office success. On screen, it all felt complete, as if every piece had fallen exactly where it should. But her story didn't stop there. Around the same time, she stepped into another role that would follow her just as closely, playing Penny Robinson in Lost in Space. The setting was completely different, far removed from the hills of Salzburg, yet it carried the same sense of familiarity for audiences who had watched her grow. She continued to appear across television, moving through shows like My Three Sons, Adam 12, and The Love Boat, each role adding another extra credit to a career that had already started so early. Later roles came and went, from the television film Scout's Honor to High School USA, and even a return to familiar ground, with appearances connected to Lost in Space, including the 1998 film and a brief role in the 2018 reimagining on Netflix. And through all of it, there's a quiet consistency in her path, one that runs beneath the surface. Because, while audiences remember the finished scenes, the real story carries on in everything that happened in between, in the years that built up to those moments, and in the ones that followed after the cameras were no longer there to capture them. Bruises and bleach. The high price of playing a Von Trapp child. On screen, everything looked effortless, right down to Julie Andrews's soft blonde hair, the kind that felt like it had always belonged to Maria. But even that familiar look came with its own complications. Her natural dark hair had been treated with highlights that were meant to lighten it, only for it to turn a bright, unexpected orange. It wasn't what anyone had planned. The solution came quickly and a little bluntly, cutting it shorter and bleaching what remained until it matched the image audiences now recognize. Around her, others went through similar changes. Daniel Trujita, who played Rolf, had his hair and even his eyebrows bleached. Years later, he would look back and connect that decision to how early his hair began to thin, long before he was ready for it. Casting itself had followed a path that almost went in a completely different direction. Andrews had already been passed over for My Fair Lady, where Audrey Hepburn took the role of Eliza Doolittle. And, for a moment, it seemed like history might repeat itself again. At one point, Hepburn had even been considered for Maria. But once 20th Century Fox took control, screenwriter Ernest Lehman held on to Andrews as his first choice. Early footage from Mary Poppins, still unreleased at the time, was enough to convince Robert Wise. One by one, other names fell away. from Grace Kelly to Doris Day, until the role settled where it would stay. The same uncertainty hovered around Captain Von Trapp. Christopher Plummer stepped into the part, but not before names like Sean Connery, Richard Burton, and Bing Crosby had been considered. Even the younger roles might have looked entirely different, with possibilities that included Mia Farrow and Kurt Russell. It all feels settled now when you watch it, but at the time, nothing about it was certain. Filming moved between Los Angeles and Salzburg, and while the city gave the film much of its beauty, it didn't come without resistance. A scene showing Nazi banners hanging through the Residenzplatz brought tension with local officials, who pushed back against the image it created. There was a line they didn't want crossed. A compromise followed. The banners could be used, but only briefly, and without any suggestion that the people of Salzburg were welcoming what was happening. It's a small detail on screen, but behind it, there was a small negotiation about how history would be shown. Time moved differently for the younger cast. Over 6 months of filming, changes that might seem small on paper became impossible to ignore in real life. Debbie Turner lost her front teeth, forcing the crew to create dentures that made singing harder than it looked. Nicholas Hammond grew several inches, enough to affect how scenes were staged, while Charmian Carr had to adjust just to maintain the illusion of being the eldest. Even Kim Carath, the youngest, found her body changing, something the film quietly worked around without drawing attention to it. The location itself added another layer. The Austrian Alps looked open and peaceful, but getting there was anything but simple. Equipment had to be moved in ways that felt almost out of another time, and comfort was limited. Andrews once recalled being bundled in a fur coat while riding on an ox cart alongside camera equipment. The contrast not lost on anyone there. And when there were no facilities nearby, even basic needs meant stepping away into the woods, something far less graceful than anything the film ever showed. Some moments came with a sharper edge. During the filming of the gazebo scene, Carr lost her footing and went straight through a pane of glass, leaving her with cuts and a sprained ankle. It could have stopped everything, but instead, the production carried on, with wardrobe and makeup quietly covering what had happened. In another scene, when Maria and the children fell from a boat, things didn't go as planned either. Carath, who couldn't swim, had to be pulled from the water, and by the next take, the situation had turned chaotic in a way no one would ever see on screen. Even something as simple as rain refused to cooperate. Salzburg brought long stretches of waiting, with the crew watching the skies and hoping for a break. And when the weather didn't help, they created their own, repeating scenes again and again until they matched what was needed. Carr's drenched run back to Maria's room took multiple takes, each one adding to the exhaustion that had already started to build. Behind the camera, Christopher Plummer carried his own frustrations. There was a time he looked at the film with open dislike, even jokingly referring to it as something far less flattering. He pushed for more depth in his character, wanting the captain to feel less rigid and more human, and that change stayed in the final version. But one issue never fully settled: his singing voice. He wanted to do it himself, but in the end, it wasn't enough. And vocalist Bill Lee was brought in to support the performance. And yet, for all of that, there were moments that felt unexpectedly light. During the filming of Something Good, exhaustion took over in a different way. Andrews and Plummer couldn't stop laughing, no matter how many times they tried to reset. The more they tried to hold it together, the worse it became, until the scene had to be filmed in near darkness just to keep it moving. Even then, traces of those smiles stayed in the final cut, barely noticeable unless you know where to look. And then, almost quietly, the real story brushed against the one being told. Maria von Trapp appeared briefly on screen during I Have Confidence, a small moment that could easily be missed. She stood there for only seconds, but the process behind it stretched on much longer, requiring patience she hadn't expected. By the time it was over, she had seen enough of that world from the inside. Acting, she decided, was something better left to Andrews. Because when everything is put together, what remains is that contrast. The version that plays on screen, smooth and untouched, and the one that existed just outside the frame, where things didn't always land the way they were meant to, and where the experience of making it carried a weight that the film itself never shows. The Sound of Mucus. Why Christopher Plummer hated his most iconic role. On screen, Captain Von Trapp felt controlled, steady, almost immovable. The kind of presence that held everything together without ever needing to say too much. But according to Christopher Plummer, the experience behind The Sound of Music didn't carry that same ease. For a film that audiences would come to see as comforting and familiar, his own connection to it was far more strained, something that never quite settled the way people might expect. He didn't soften that view either. Over the years, he reduced the film to a nickname that followed it everywhere, referring to it as The Sound of Mucus, a line that revealed just how far removed he felt from what it represented. In a 2011 conversation with The Hollywood Reporter, he described it as overly sentimental and difficult to navigate as an actor, recalling how he had to work hard just to bring a trace of humor into something he found overwhelmingly sweet. It wasn't just a passing comment. It was a feeling that stayed with him for decades. For most people, the film became something to return to, something that held emotion in a way that felt genuine and lasting. But for him, it moved in the opposite direction. Even though he eventually came to see it differently, he spent years describing himself as someone who never fully connected with it, despite the fact that it was the role that made him widely known. He passed away in 2021 at the age of 91, and for much of his life, that tension between him and the film never fully disappeared. What made it more complicated was how quickly it all happened. Much of his work on the film, especially in the Austrian Alps, was completed in a relatively short time, yet the impact of it stayed far longer than the experience itself. He later recalled how the environment, filled with pastries and long days, left its own mark in lighter ways, but once filming ended, a different feeling settled in. The role began to follow him, attaching itself to his name in a way that felt limiting rather than rewarding. By the time he was cast, he was already established on stage, brought in at 34, and even asked to appear older, with gray added to his hair. He had taken the role with a specific goal in mind, hoping it would help prepare him for playing Cyrano de Bergerac in a Broadway production that wouldn't happen until years later. Instead, he found himself in a story that leaned heavily on music and sentiment, standing alongside a singing governess and a group of children, far from the kind of material he had built his career around. The early reaction didn't help. Some reviews were direct in their criticism, with the New York Times singling him out in a way that lingered. At that point, it might have seemed like the film would fade, but instead, it did the opposite. Slowly, it grew into something widely loved, returning again and again, becoming a constant presence, rather than something that disappeared. For him, that only added to the frustration. In a later interview with the Boston Globe, he reflected on the role with a kind of detachment, admitting that he found the character uninteresting despite the effort put into it. He saw it as something that didn't align with his own taste, something that simply wasn't meant for him, even as it meant so much to everyone else. And yet, time had a way of changing how he saw it. In his 2012 autobiography, In Spite of Myself, he still referred to the film in a dismissive way, but he also recalled a moment that began to alter his perspective. At a gathering, he was asked to stay and watch the film with a group of children who wanted to see Captain Von Trapp watching himself. What began as something he resisted slowly turned into something else. As the film played, he found himself seeing it differently, noticing what it did well, how it held together, how it reached people. He later reflected that the more he watched, the more he recognized its strength, describing it as warm, touching, and timeless, and admitting that he felt a growing sense of pride in having been part of it. It wasn't a sudden change, but it was enough to soften what had been there before. In later conversations, including one with Vanity Fair, he acknowledged that the film offered something people were looking for, a kind of escape that stood apart from everything else around it. He described it as old-fashioned in a way that still worked, something that carried a simple structure, but held onto it with confidence, built on familiar elements that continued to resonate. By the time he attended the film's 50th anniversary screening in 2015, standing alongside Julie Andrews, that long-held resistance had eased into something quieter. There was still a trace of the old attitude, something Andrews even teased him about, but it no longer carried the same edge. Because at some point, the distance between what he wanted the film to be and what it became stopped mattering as much. And in the end, he seemed to understand what it meant to the people watching it. He noted that families continued to return to it, bringing their children along, treating it as something safe, something reliable in a world that often felt uncertain. Not the kind of role he set out to define his career with, but one that stayed anyway, settling into a place he didn't choose at first, but eventually came to accept. Angela Cartwright reveals what happened on The Sound of Music. Set? It's bad. On screen, everything about The Sound of Music felt untouched, almost too perfect to question. But according to Angela Cartwright, what happened behind the scenes didn't always match what audiences saw. Beneath the music and the carefully held smiles, there were moments that didn't sit right, moments that stayed with the cast long after filming ended, and ones that quietly change how that entire experience looks when you step away from the finished film. 60 years later, those memories haven't faded into something softer. If anything, they've settled into something clearer. Cartwright, who was just 13 when she played Brigitte, remembers that time as more than just a film set. It was a year away from home, a year spent growing up in a space that looked magical from the outside but carried its own pressures underneath. What began as a shared experience between young actors slowly turned into something deeper, something that held even when everything else moved on. They still talk. They still meet. The group that once played the Von Trapp children now lives scattered across different parts of the world. But when they come back together, it doesn't feel distant. They even gave themselves a name, the Non-Trapps, something light on the surface, but rooted in something real. They've been present in each other's lives through births, marriages, and loss, holding on to a connection that didn't end when filming wrapped. Time has taken some of them. Charmian Carr and Heather Menzies are no longer there, but their absence hasn't broken what remains. The others still return to each other in a way that feels unchanged, picking up conversations without needing to explain the years in between. It's not something forced, it's something that stayed. And the film itself never really left either. In places far from where it was made, like Florence, audiences still gather, watching it in another language and reacting the same way people always have. There's still that pull, that sense that something about it reaches beyond where it started. People travel just to see it, sitting in crowded rooms, drawn into a story they already know, but still want to feel again. At the center of those memories is Julie Andrews, who, according to Cartwright, was nothing like the distant star people might expect. She stayed present. During long stretches of waiting, especially when the rain slowed everything down, she didn't disappear into a trailer. She stayed with the children, sang with them, taught them songs, and kept them engaged in a way that made the set feel less like work and more like something shared. That closeness didn't just happen on camera. It was built in the quiet moments in between. Even years later, that connection found its way back. When Andrews was honored by the American Film Institute, the remaining cast came together again, stepping onto the stage not as individuals, but as a group that still moved together. They sang, and the audience followed, voices blending into something that felt familiar, almost like stepping back into a moment that never fully ended. Christopher Plummer brought something different to that experience. His relationship with the film was never as simple, but his presence carried weight in ways that lasted. Beneath the strictness of Captain Von Trapp, there were small details that revealed something softer, something more human. It's something that becomes clearer the more closely you watch, especially when the film is seen the way it was meant to be seen, where those quieter moments don't slip past unnoticed. But not everything about that time felt as controlled as it looked on screen. The long months, the constant waiting, the feeling of being far from home longer than expected, it all built up. The children, still young, found ways to push against that stillness. Shoes were moved around hotel hallways, breakfast orders quietly swapped, and on rainy days, rolls of toilet paper were thrown from windows, aimed at umbrellas below. It wasn't serious, but it was real, a glimpse into what it felt like to be in that space day after day. The setting itself didn't always make things easier. Salzburg looked beautiful on screen, but the constant rain slowed everything down, stretching filming longer than anyone had expected. Days were spent waiting, watching the weather, trying to hold on to momentum while everything around them stood still. It added a kind of pressure that never made it into the film but stayed with those who were there. And yet, when they return now, those same places feel unchanged. The gardens, the steps, and the streets, they're all still there, almost exactly as they were. Standing there doesn't feel like looking back. It feels immediate, like stepping into something that never fully moved on. As the film returns to theaters again in 2025, there's a sense that people aren't just watching it. They're stepping into it in a way that feels closer, more complete. On a larger screen, with everything opened up, the story reaches both those seeing it for the first time and those who have carried it with them for years. And for Cartwright, that response still matters. Because in the end, what stays isn't just the image people remember. It's everything that sat behind it. Everything that didn't quite fit into the final cut. The film still feels warm, still feels whole, but the experience of making it carries a different layer. One that doesn't erase what audiences love, but quietly changes how it's seen once you know what was happening just outside the frame. What scene is your favorite till this very day? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.